Hi everybody, week 1 of our quilting course is learning how to patchwork using contents from the patchwork kit. There were a couple of extra things that you needed to bring along for this session, and that includes a pair of scissors, a pencil or something to make a mark with, a ruler or a tape measure, and an iron and an ironing board, and I've got mine here ready to go. And then you just need a couple of things from the patchwork kit as well. It's not all of it, it's only these following items. We're going to use the wheel of pins, the needle and the threader. You might not even need that, but I think it's kind of handy to have in there. The spool of thread, and then 2 or more colours from your patchwork kit. I'm just going to work with 2 at the moment. And these are the patterned or coloured pieces of cotton from the kit. There's 7 in total, but I picked out 2. And then you need to make a selection between 2 of these quilting block options that we've got. These are printed out on the lilac paper. One of them is a kind of little, I think it looks like a bit like a parquet floor design here. And one of them is a kind of square that repeats within itself to make a sort of diamond shape. These are the 2 options, and I'm going to start with this one because I think it's a bit more difficult. It'd be good to show you guys how that one's done, but the same techniques apply to doing this one as well. First of all, we're going to take the block design and carefully cut out each one of these shapes that have a black line on them from the paper. If you think you might forget how this design looks when you're trying to piece it back together, take a photo of it beforehand. Now using our pencil, ruler and the interfacing, which is the kind of large, slightly shiny on one side piece of very sheer fabric in the kit, sort of A3 size, we're going to use this and our shapes to draw around each one onto the interfacing. Now, interfacing is a kind of stiffener that's used to sort of thicken up fabrics when you're working with them. It means that you could work with really delicate or slightly thin or sheer silks and fabrics if you wanted to patchwork with them. Maybe you were working with lots of fabrics that had a different density and you wanted to thicken some of them up. This is what you would use. So in order to have a bit of practice with this, I've included this in the kit. And the first thing we're going to make is starting with this, although it might not be something you want to use if you want your quilts to be really supple and soft and conventional. So we're going to take each of these shapes, we're going to draw around them with the pencil, but crucially I'm going to leave a 1 centimetre extra edge around every single shape, because that's going to be what's called our seam allowance. So actually, if I kind of place that there, I can almost add on my 1 centimetre without actually having to draw it on the edge, this first one. Okay. You might want to actually mark your 1 centimetre, or if you feel pretty comfortable estimating it like I do, and are happy for there to be slight discrepancies when you're making your quilt, you don't have to. The only thing is, much like any kind of mathematical putting together, once you start sewing these things to make a kind of tessellated pattern, you might really wish you'd been neat about it. And professional quilters will always be a lot more precise with what they do. So there's my first shape. And again, I'm leaving my 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way around. I've lost a little bit on the edge there. Put that in there. You end up having bigger shapes than you would have first thought, especially on some of these angled shapes like triangles. So it's always good to make sure you've got the right amount of interfacing and fabric, and that's why in the kits there's a really big piece for you. So I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces there, and I've got 1 there, and now I just need to make 4 little interfacing pieces for the tiny triangles, making sure I've got 1 centimetre allowance around them as well. It goes to show just how much you need, because my triangle there for this tiny one is actually quite large. It's almost the same size as one of these. So you need quite a bit for those seam allowances, but they are essential to sort of make sure that your quilt doesn't fall apart. All right, so I've got my 4 little ones there with a nice 1 centimetre around each one on the interfacing, and I've got my larger ones here. Amazing. Right, now I can just cut out my pencil lines. It's good to have a nice sharp pair of scissors if you're going to be working with fabric. And actually they do say that paper can actually sort of blunt scissors. So often a good studio practice is to have a pair of scissors that is exclusively for fabric and a pair that is only used for paper. The fabric scissors become very precious because you need them to be sharp always to kind of cut through the fibres. Mine aren't super sharp, but they are doing the job on this interfacing. Okay, amazing. So here I've got, missing a couple of tiny corners, but I think that'll be okay. I've got 4 big triangles, 4 smaller triangles, and then my square that's going to go in the middle. And if you're working with this one, you're going to have 1 large rectangle, 2 smaller rectangles that match one another, and 2 smaller squares that match one another, and they're all going to have a 1 centimetre seam allowance around them as well. So the next thing we can do with these is iron them onto the fabric on my ironing board. If I was making a regular quilt, which is what most of you will go on to do after this episode and practicing with the interfacing, if I was going to make a regular one and I wasn't going to use this stuff, what you would do is you would use the shapes and your 1 centimetre seam allowance to draw around them directly onto the fabric and then cut those out instead. So you'd miss this step where you're ironing the interfacing onto the back of this. Interfacing, or stiffener, fabric stiffener, is a kind of sort of gauzy fabric in different weights that has glue that's been kind of coated onto one side. It can be quite hard to see without a lot of light, but you can always tell which side has the glue on because it will be a little bit shinier than the others. So this is the mattified side. Oh no, sorry, that's the side with the glue. You can see a tiny little sheen there, a kind of shimmery, glittery reflection, and then the mattified side doesn't have that. So it's the side with the shimmer, the reflection, the little glittery bit, that's the side with the glue. And that's the side that we're going to put face downwards and iron onto our fabric. If you ever want to check and you're not too sure, because it can wreck your iron if you iron it on the wrong side and get glue on it, is just do a tiny little test on your ironing board. Take your iron and your piece of interfacing and find the tiniest little corner and do a little iron. If you're ironing it on the side that doesn't have glue, that corner is going to stick a tiny, tiny bit to your ironing board and it won't be too much of a problem. If you're ironing on the wrong side, you'll get a tiny bit of glue on your iron, but it won't be the end of the world and it won't stick. So you can see there that I'm ironing the glued side and it doesn't stick. If I iron the side that does, if I iron on the side that doesn't have any glue on, the gluey side is going to warm up and stick to the ironing board. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with my big square being a light colour in the middle, and this is where your quilt designing will come in. So you can see from this that the combination that you put your fabrics in really determines the way the quilt's going to look. At the moment, I think what I'd like to do is something that looks a little bit like this. So I'm going to have my I'm going to do something that looks like this actually. I'm going to have my lighter colour in the centre, my darker colour on the outside interior, and then on the final outside I'm going to have a lighter colour again. So I'll start with this light colour for my interior square. So for that I'm going to take my piece of interfacing and look for the shiny side, which is this side. You can see it just down there reflecting a little bit. I'm going to put it onto my piece of fabric, and this time I don't need to leave a 1 centimetre allowance at all. I can just iron it straight on. I've got my setting at a relatively hot, and actually all you need it on is a kind of medium. If you find that you're, maybe 50% of its potential temperature, if you find that your iron is making the interfacing ripple a little, or that it's not sticking at all, it's just kind of wafting off again, it'll mean the iron's too hot, too cold. If it's rippling, it's too hot. If it's not activating the glue at all, it means it's too cold. So I've ironed that on. And then I'll get busy with my red to put the, let's see, they're very close inside my medium-sized triangles on, and iron them down. Again, I'm making sure the shiny side is going downwards onto the fabric so that the glue is the one that's touching the surface of my fabric. And an important thing to remember as well is that I'm ironing these onto the back of the fabric. So I've got my pattern on the front, but the interfacing is applied to the back. With the coloured panels, it doesn't matter so much because they're coloured either side, but on these ones that have patterns, it does. And again, I'm checking for the shiny side of my fabric. That's the matte side, that's the shiny one. So I know that's the side that's got the glue, my interfacing fabric. And I'm resting that on what I could consider to be the back side of my patchwork fabric. And I'm ironing it down. There we go. So I've got these two done already. You can see I'm going to have a lot of leftover fabric. And I've got a nice red that's going to be the smaller triangles. I'm going to go for this pink with the final big triangles. There's so many different types of pattern to choose from your kit. And we've included, rather than having just two colours, we've included quite a few so you can make a pick. But remember, this is just to practice with and is entirely to get used to the process. We'll be talking about how to design your quilts in a later sort of episode of the course. There we go. So I'm ironing on those two. And my final two go on here. I'm missing some little parts there, but they'll sort of get swallowed up in the patchworking process, so I'm not too worried about those. All right, so now I have interfacing on all of my pieces of fabric. I can cut these out and get ready to patchwork with them. So in the end, I end up with all of my pieces of lilac paper shapes have now got a corresponding piece of fabric that's either in a pattern or a plain colour, and it's got a nice piece of interfacing on the back that's helped me to cut it to exactly the right size for my design. In preparation for sewing our pieces together now, you're going to need yourself the needle from the kit, which has kind of been securely stuck down and got a nice little dot over it to protect you from the sharp needle, and some thread. I always work with about 2 arms lengths of thread so that I've got enough to kind of keep me going. It's only a sort of arm stretch away when I'm sewing, and there's enough to kind of loop it back through the needle so we've got some tolerance and the needle isn't always unthreading. So I've got about 2 arms lengths there, and I'm going to take my needle. Because my scissors aren't very sharp, this threader might actually come, this wire needle threader might come in handy. To use it, I'm going to poke the wire through the eye of the needle, like so, and then it gives me a nice big wire shape to drop my thread through, like so. And then I simply pull the needle back over the thread and tug it all the way through. It's very handy if you've got a needle that has a tiny eye, which means the hole in the end of the needle. And then I'm going to pull it along so I've got enough to sew with, and there's a nice little kind of like tail of thread or tolerance left over in order to stop the needle from unthreading. Now that you've got your stiffened shapes ready to sew together, it actually helps to do them in a particular order, and that order is illustrated on the handout that you've been sent and that's available to download from the special members area of the website. The order I'm going to do them in is stitching this to here first, then that to there, then that one to there, and then that one to there. And I can see it's going to make a nice square design that's going to enable me to then stitch another one onto the outside like that, and so forth, going all the way around, making my quilt block. When I'm lining up my first 2 to stitch together, what I tend to do is kind of estimate, and you can use your pencil to do this, where the center of your piece of fabric is, and then where the center of the second piece of fabric is too, and line those up. The tendency can be to kind of line up to the edge, justify it to this part, but then because where we're actually stitching is going to be 1 centimetre in, you'll find that when you eventually fan out your design and take a look at it, you've lost a whole chunk over here. So we're always lining up our pattern pieces, our little quilt block pieces, so that they are in the centre, matching in the centre each time. And to keep things in place while you're sewing, I've included these pins, so you can put 1 or 2 into your patchwork pieces to keep them in place. I tend to pin a bit further away from where I'm going to be stitching, because it does make the fabric sort of wrinkle, and it can change the way it kind of rests on top of one another. Now the line we're going to sew is going to be a 1 centimetre bit of selvage, a kind of seam allowance. This is what we measured for before, and it results in a shape that will be a little like this. So you could either draw your design on top of your pattern pieces again, or I like to kind of just give myself a little indication of where 1 centimetre is, and then I stick to that line. If you know how to, you could put a little knot in the end of your thread. Some people like to do this by rolling it over their finger a couple of times, maybe 3, and then rolling it off the end of the finger to kind of get it wrapped up in itself a little, and then using your fingernails to pull it taut, making a little kind of knotted up end. I don't love doing that because I never trust these. I feel like they could fall apart. And also it makes for kind of a bump in your fabric every time you're sewing something. So instead, what I like to do, I'll just snip that off. This is like the sewing 101. Instead, what I like to do is I stitch in and out of an area lots of times, maybe like 2 or 3 to get me started, and it kind of knots the fabric. Stitching in the same place a couple of times stops it usually from undoing. So you can see here, I'm going to poke my needle into the fabric and out again to create almost like a little fold that I've put a stitch through. And I'm going to pull my needle through, pull the thread through until it's near the end but not quite, like so. And then I'm just going to go back and do it again, maybe even try and do an even smaller stitch in the same place, like so. Pull it through. Now, if I was to tug this really hard, it would come out. But if I do a third one, wait, or is this the second one? There we go. Another one through there. Pull it through. That shouldn't go anywhere now. It's really taut, and actually it's kind of bonded the fabric together without having a little lump. So that's what I prefer to do. But your knotting preferences are up to you. And now I'm going to do what's called a running stitch all the way across my line here to join the 2 fabrics together. A running stitch is where you go in and out, just like I did with the folds of fabric, in and out of your fabric to create a little line, a dashed line almost. Now the 2 ways you can do that, you can poke it through, leaving a little gap in between where your original stitch was. These can go out of the way. You can poke it through, leaving a little gap, and then coming up from the underside of the fabric, I usually use kind of like my nail and the anticipation of where it's going to come through, creating a little gap there. So you can go out, pull it through, and then up from the bottom, pull it through. And that is how you create a stitched straight line. Again, I'm going through the 2 fabrics, leaving a little gap between the stitch I've just made and where I'll sort of plant the next one. Ooh. Like so. And then where I'll come back through, and you might even, if you're very new to stitching, you might even want to turn it over. Let's get the focus. You might want to turn it over and poke through on the other side with a small gap in between where you came through in the first place, then turn it back to what would be the front. And that feels quite labour intensive, but it is, you know, how most people learn to sew. You kind of travel from one side to the other of the fabric, leaving a little gap in between each kind of puncture of the fabric. The way I like to stitch, because it saves a bit of time, is I do what I did for my first stitch. I kind of push my needle through, but instead of going all the way through, I then fold the fabric a little and puncture the other side in order to make a kind of little lump there that I've stitched through, poked my needle through, and then I tug it all the way through. So that saves me from having to flip the fabric over and turn to the back each time. And if I simply repeat that and follow my straight line, you can see there, I've punctured a little fold. Eventually I can work my way all the way across the fabric. You'll probably see now why it seems like a good idea when you're first learning to use this interfaced fabric, because it means the fabric can stay quite stiff and you can manipulate it that touch more easily. If we were using cotton just on its own, which I'd encourage you to do when you start quilting for real, it's much floppier and harder to work with, but you definitely get the hang of it and it keeps your quilts really soft and supple. So now I'm even being a bit ambitious and I'm stitching 2 little folds in the fabric, puncturing all the way through. I'm using the needle to kind of create these waves and then pulling it all the way through. And I'm making a little stitch line all the way along. You can see the stitches are not the line on this side, but I'm always tracking about 1 centimetre away from the edge. So we keep going all the way along our line. trying to keep the stitches as small as you can without being so ridiculously small that they don't actually go through to the other side, because the idea of this folding and bending is you still want to make sure you're creating a stitch on the other side and not only folding the top layer of fabric. But if I go all the way along like so, you can even take out the pins as you're going, because this will be quite secured now. I won't need them as much, and I don't want to prick myself with them if I don't need to. Going all the way along until I get to what is going to be the end of the fabric on the underside, because it's actually ending a bit sooner than the top fabric, you can see. Now you'll see why that happens in the future when we're stitching the other ones on. And so now, to complete it, just like I did at the start, I'm going to go in and out of the same place a few times. So I'll do my little pinch the fabric and do a little fold and stitch through the fold. 1, 2, I'm not moving the needle at all, I'm going in and out of the same little place, almost like looping it. 3, I might even just do one for luck, 4, that's a lot, but there we go. So that isn't going anywhere now. If I try to separate them, they're really anchored together. And that is my first stitch line. I can trim my fabric, my thread, my fabric down. And that is my first piece of patchworking done. 2 bonded fabrics ready to go. Now I've got my 2 fabrics, first 2 pieces. Before I move on to my next piece that I'm sewing onto this side here, I'm going to do what's known as ironing the seams open. The reason we do this is to make sure that our fabric patch, our kind of quilting block, is going to rest really, really flat when we're sewing it together with lots of others. If we didn't, you might find that you get like 3 layers of fabric on one side of your fabric that you're trying to stitch through, instead of, you know, the minimum, which in this case is 2. And it keeps all of the orientation of the quilt really nice and flat. So what we do is we get our iron, which we've got to one side. You might have turned it off, but that goes back on again. And from the other side of your little patched piece, this almost looks like a bit like a house, I like that. You turn it over, and the other side you open out those seams with your fingers, and you very carefully, taking care not to burn yourself, you do what's known as ironing them open. So it's pressing them flat so that you're kind of exposing the seam on this side as well as this side. And you can even turn it over and iron a little bit there as well. And at this point, I would even recommend, if you feel like it, perhaps snipping off some of these extra bits. Any way you can lose fabric as you go is a good idea, but you always just need to be a bit careful that you're not chopping off something that you might need. So in this case, I know I can take these off because now I'm going to be sewing across here for my next one. So to do that, I'm going to take another of my red pieces, and once again, just to be really proper with it, I'm going to make a little mark in the center there, and I'm going to make a mark in the original center of my piece here. So it's not the one that's been made now, because that's going to actually be further along. Instead, it's going to be in the center of the original square, like so. Because once we put all the sides on, the center is going to remain in the original center, not the new ones we've made. So if I line those up like so, and make sure when I put them together, they're roughly joining up. I must say that I'm a big fan of a wonky quilt, and I always encourage people to do the best practice they can, but don't give yourself a hard time. It's definitely supposed to be enjoyable, and you will pick this stuff up as you go. It's better sometimes to learn from our mistakes. So you remember what you can, you do your very best, but otherwise you're going to end up, you know, you're still going to end up with a quilt that's very original to you, even if all of the pieces don't match. You'll definitely get better from practice. So I can see there that my centers of each original piece are fairly well matched up. And once again, I might take my ruler and produce a little 1 centimetre seam allowance on my version of it all the way along. And now I'm going to do a stitch across here. So you can see here I'm stitching all the way to the very end, but the reality is once I iron this open and I'm sewing a new piece along here, I am going to lose this edge anyway, but just to be good and do best practice, we're still going to create the whole design right to the end, even if we know we'll lose some of it in the seam allowance. So I'll finish my stitching, and once again I'm stitching in several places to create a knotted end, a kind of bound end, and I cut off a little tail, and now I'm ready to iron the seam allowance open for this one too. All right, I'm building up my design now. Once more, I can chop these off. Won't do too much, but it does save kind of bulking going on because we've already got quite a lot building up here. Now we're ready to stitch on a third side. I can pick either side. I think I'll go with this one. Let's find the center. Yeah, it's about there. One of the reasons it's quite important to stitch in a straight line on quilting and patchworking, or it does help, is that it makes for very square and kind of easy to tessellate pieces once you've finished. There are different ways of quilting where maybe we don't need to worry about that, but certainly when we're trying to create some geometry, it's good to keep those lines as straight as possible. So once again, I'm going to start at the very end and go in and out a few times to create in the same place to create, oh, I've lost my little tail there, to create my bound knotted end. And then I'm going to travel along the line. When the fabric's very thick, it is actually easier to just push through the fabric to the other side and then start from the back and push to the front again, because it's kind of harder to get that sort of wave of fabric that you're going to stick your needle through. And now that we've got several layers in these corners building up, it does get a bit more difficult. I've reached my end, I can go in and out of the same place, ready to complete it, create a kind of bound knotted end again. There we go. Take out my pins, and once again, for the third time, I can fold this out, iron open my seams on the back, and can really see how my design is starting to grow. Cool, huh? You can see how when one more triangle goes on there, we're really going to be starting to have our little kind of twisted square design. Now that we've got our first little square with its inset square ready to stitch our new edges onto to make a further kind of outer square. Now, if yours is looking a little bit wonky, don't worry. It's always going to happen with fabrics that are cut on the bias, meaning that they kind of have a little bit of a stretch. And also, the sewing together of all of these triangles onto squares can be a bit challenging. You will get used to it the more you practice, and remember, this is your first attempt, likely. So, now what we're going to do is take one of our outer triangles, and I've tended to kind of put a little fold in it to make a nice 1 centimetre seam allowance, so I can almost guide myself where that's going to be, making sure not to stretch it or curve it at all. A nice straight line fold of 1 centimetre, and then I'm going to take one of the areas of my quilt piece and I'm going to line it up, my patchwork piece, and I'm going to line it up like so, making sure that the top part of my interior square is reaching that fold and kind of hitting it nicely. And so that way I know when I flip this up and eventually open out my design once it's stitched, it's going to make a nice straight line, and it's not going to kind of like come into my square too much or be too far beyond it. You start to notice those types of things. If in the end that is what happens with yours, don't worry, but it's just nice to kind of be as precise as we can be. So I've folded it over, I've moved it up so it touches the very edge of my interior square and folded it back. And also I'm taking care that my little point down here is actually pointing to the bottom end of the interior square. If I instead had it going over there somehow, you can see how it would start to create a kind of odd square as it goes. So that's a good rule of thumb, to make sure that you're kind of doing it at 90 degrees each time, or 45 degrees, I'm not sure. There we go. So I know that's in the right place, and I've just reached the end of my kind of tip of my corner there. I'm going to pin that down, and I'm going to use my fold, which is quite evident in the interfacing, but just to be sure, I'm going to draw a little line across here as well. And now I'm going to stitch this down as well. There we go. So that one's ready to go. Once again, I'm ironing the seam open to get it nice and flat and prepare to attach my next and outer corner edge. I'm going to do the same thing again. Fold a nice line and get it at a good right angle where it's touching the corner of my interior square. And I know that the point down here, thereabouts, is pointing downwards towards the bottom. You can see here there's quite a lot of selvage at the top, but that's okay. We're just going to follow that line. Across there.